The year 2020 had descended like a shroud. Fear was the currency. The virus, an invisible enemy, stalked the headlines and haunted conversations. In South Africa, a nation familiar with struggle, the initial response was one of grim determination. People largely complied with the sudden drastic measures, lockdowns, restrictions. The promise, whispered by authorities, was a swift return to normalcy, a short, sharp shock to defeat the unseen foe. But 2021 dawned with a different hue. The virus, far from vanquished, had become a persistent, unwelcome guest. The promised swift victory never materialized. Instead, waves of infection brought renewed lockdowns, ever-shifting regulations, and a growing sense of unease. The initial fear, sharp and acute, began to morph. It transformed into a dull, chronic ache of fatigue. The adrenaline that had powered compliance in the early days ebbed away. It left behind a populace weary of the endless emergency. The narrative of a temporary crisis was wearing thin, exposing a more unsettling reality of sustained disruption. The new normal was relentlessly marketed, yet it felt profoundly abnormal. This fatigue was not merely physical, a tiredness from queuing or staying indoors. It was a deeper, more corrosive exhaustion. The instruments of control, once alien, began to blend into the fabric of daily life. Masks became as commonplace as shoes, a second skin donned without a second thought before stepping outside. Bottles of hand sanitizer stood sentinel at every doorway, their sharp scent a constant reminder of the pervasive threat, real or perceived. Social distancing, an awkward dance of avoidance, became an ingrained habit, reshaping public interaction. These were no longer presented as temporary emergency measures. They were subtly yet firmly woven into the expected behaviors of the compliant citizen. Curfews, which in pre-pandemic times would have signaled martial law or extreme civil unrest, became a routine feature of the urban and rural night. The rhythm of life, once dictated by work, family and community, was now significantly governed by government decree. The simple act of being outside after a certain hour became a transgression. Questioning the necessity or the duration of these measures became increasingly difficult. South Africa, like many nations, did not navigate the pandemic in isolation. Its policies were profoundly shaped by powerful external forces. Global health organizations, well-funded international bodies, and influential philanthropic foundations exerted immense influence, often far from public scrutiny. Their doctrines, research papers, and policy recommendations became the blueprints for national responses. The World Health Organization's pronouncements carried immense weight, shaping everything from testing protocols to lockdown strategies. These global entities became arbiters of truth, their guidance presented as unassailable scientific consensus, difficult for national governments to ignore or defy. Best practices and global standards were imported and implemented, sometimes with a disconcerting one-size-fits-all approach. Section 4. Erasing the past, engineering the future identity under siege. The protracted crisis of 2021 became more than a public health emergency. It evolved into a fertile ground for reshaping societal narratives and, crucially, public memory. This was not always a blatant, jackbooted affair. It was often subtle, cloaked in the language of progress, safety, or decolonization, yet its effects were profound. The past, with its inconvenient truths and symbols of resistance, became a contested space. The architects of the new order understood that to control the future, one must first control the interpretation of the past. A compliant populace is one unmoored from its historical anchors. Changes began to ripple through educational curricula. The emphasis shifted. Certain historical events were downplayed, others reinterpreted to fit new narratives that aligned with a more globalized, less nationally distinct identity. Heritage sites, potent symbols of South Africa's complex and often painful history, saw their stories reframed. Plaques were updated, exhibits altered. Section 5. The whispers grow louder, seeds of suspicion and a dawning realization. Despite the pervasive fatigue and the relentless drumbeat of official narratives, a current of unease began to stir beneath the surface of South African society. The initial acceptance of authority born of fear started to fray as inconsistencies mounted. The goalposts for ending restrictions seemed to shift constantly. The economic devastation wrought by prolonged lockdowns felt increasingly disproportionate to the stated aims, especially for the most vulnerable. Whispers of doubt, initially confined to private conversations, began to find a more public, albeit cautious, voice. People started comparing notes, sharing observations of a reality that didn't quite match the official story. Local community organizations and civil society groups, many of which had initially partnered with the government in the crisis response, started to ask more pointed questions. They observed the heavy-handed enforcement in poorer areas compared to more affluent suburbs. They noted the lucrative contracts awarded with little transparency. Section 6. Fractured faith, forging futures, resistance, revival and rifts. As the year 2021 wore on, the growing unease began to coalesce into tangible forms of resistance. This was not always organized in grand protests. Often it manifested in small acts of non-compliance, in the persistent questioning of authority, in the sharing of alternative information. Communities started to find ways to support each other outside the official channels, reviving old networks of solidarity. There was a reassertion of individual and local autonomy, a pushing back against the homogenizing pressures of the centralized state and its global backers. This resistance was diverse, sometimes contradictory, but united by a desire to reclaim agency. A reawakening of historical consciousness became a powerful undercurrent. People began to draw parallels between the current restrictions and past struggles for freedom and self-determination in South Africa. The memory of apartheid, with its past laws and state control, resonated uncomfortably with some of the pandemic measures. Simultaneously, spiritual traditions, which had often been marginalized or seen as secondary to secular governance, experienced a resurgence. Faith communities became crucial spaces for solace, critical discussion, and the articulation of moral objections to the perceived overreach of power, offering narratives of hope and resilience beyond the state's control. Yet, this period of awakening and resistance also brought profound new divisions.